So for today's lesson, we're going to be looking at the EU and trying to assess what were the aims of the EU, how successful they are in fulfilling those aims, and how does the EU, or to what extent does the EU contribute to the afterlife of parliamentary sovereignty? So I think the first question to consider when looking at the EU is, in 2016, Britain had a referendum, and in that referendum, it concluded that Britain wanted to leave the EU. 17.5 million people voted in 2016 for Brexit, to leave the EU. So what I want you to do is listen to these two clips. One is from a documentary advocating Brexit, and then the other is from a very well-known figure who was anti-EU, Nigel Farage. And I want you to just note down the different reasons highlighted in both clips for Euroscepticism, so being anti-European Union.
We, the people, are being cajoled, frightened and bullied into surrendering our democracy and freedom. This film is a rallying cry. We must fight for our independence, for the right to determine ourselves the laws under which we live, and for the freedom to shape our own future. In this film, we'll see how the EU works.
It's like heaven for the politician or bureaucrat because it's power without accountability.
It was devised to make sure that the great mass of the people could not control government ever again.
The EU is turning into a dictatorship, and this is not overstating it.
We will see what the EU has done to Britain.
The EU has just obliterated the English fishing industry altogether.
The European policies that we face are really the single biggest threat to our competitiveness.
We'll see why Fortress Europe has been such a calamity for the European economy.
What we see is the EU bringing up the drawbridge.
The European Union has become an economic basket case.
Certainly it is not in our economic interests to remain within the European Union. No way.
We will look at the risks of tying our fate to the failing EU.
Extremism at both ends is being fostered by the anti-democratic nature of the European Union.
Far from being it safer for us to be in the EU, there are dangers that go along with us being members of the EU, being dragged into situations we don't want to get in.
And we'll look at how independence could transform Britain.
We have huge scope for creating vast numbers of new jobs.
Outside Europe, we could have prosperity on a level that we can't even imagine now.
We're being asked to give up the right to govern ourselves. What are we being offered in return that could possibly be worth it?
Just shows utter contempt for what they think people are like, because they really do believe that these little trinkets are going to buy us off.
What really matters is that you should have the power to remove the people who govern you.
Okay, so a very elaborate documentary there, and a bit over-dramatised, you could argue. But you can see the themes coming up in that short trailer for that documentary were things about independence, things about unelected bureaucrats governing the UK, and making quite a clear argument there that we are in the afterlife of Parliament because the EU essentially makes it so that Parliament doesn't really matter anymore. Also, you have there talking about things like trade and how the EU is restricting British trade, and claims that Britain would be richer and financially better off outside of the European Union.
Just imagine, though, we weren't debating whether we should stay or leave. Just imagine we were debating whether we should join the European Union. And I put it to you that what we ought to do is vote yes in a referendum to join a club that will cost us £55 million a day as a membership fee, that will give us thousands of new laws over which our own Parliament and you, the electorate, can make no difference. It'll mean an open border, unconditionally, to 485 million people from across the whole of Europe, many of them from very poor countries, and they can come here and work and live and settle and bring their families and do as they wish. And it would also mean that we would have to cut our links with other parts of the world, the Commonwealth, the Anglosphere, and many other parts of the world, because we'd lose the ability to make our own trade deals. I know the result of that referendum. You wouldn't join it. The debate here today is between a tired status quo defending a crumbling European Union that frankly isn't working anymore, and a fresh approach which says let's be friendly with Europe, let's trade with Europe, but not be governed by their institutions.
Okay, so you can see there again, Nigel Farage is emphasising a different side of the argument, which wasn't mentioned so much in the documentary, and that was immigration. So he's arguing that Britain has no control over their borders because of the European Union. He's also arguing that Britain is restricted because they can't connect strongly with the Anglosphere. So the Anglosphere is Britain and America, and he's making the argument that because Britain's a member of the EU, Britain can no longer have that relationship with America in the same way. And also really focusing on this idea that British sovereignty, so parliamentary sovereignty, is lost to the European Union. So are there actually any grounds to this? So this argument won in 2016, and part of it was the focus of this idea of let's take back control. That was the motto of the Leave campaign. Let's take back control. Take back control. And you can see that this creates this very anti-European sentiment. This idea that Britain should be able to govern itself. Britain is a strong nation. Britain would be better off outside Europe. And that the EU is some form of dictatorship, and it's a dictatorship from Brussels, where it's these invisible and faceless bureaucrats making decisions on British laws and British lives without the consent of the people, arguing that they are unelected as well. So very, very negative perceptions on the EU in Britain. And I think the best book that I've read that really highlights the reasonings behind these issues is Heroic Failure by Fintan O'Toole. It's a very readable book, it's not very long either, and it looks at this idea of how Britain perceives itself and British identity, and how the EU is completely contrary to a lot of those ideas. So what we're looking at then is, we're looking at this argument, does the EU take away Britain's sovereignty? Is there any truth in the rhetoric we heard in 2016? You can see just the racially motivated propaganda that came out in this campaign, which was absolutely horrible. And it's this idea of Nigel Farage standing in front of a poster saying breaking point and arguing that Britain has no control of its borders. So is that true? Does Britain have no control of its borders? Also arguing that this problem of a borderless Europe means that there are immigrants taking jobs, which is obviously completely false and a ridiculous argument. So the European Union then, what does that actually mean? So it is an association of 28 states, although potentially 27 when Britain leaves, or if Britain actually leaves. It was originally called the European Economic Community, which was founded in 1957, and so as you can see from the name there, it was initially an economic community, so about guaranteeing free trade. So people on the left tend to be very anti further European integration, because what that just essentially meant was there was a free market across European states, and that really just meant that labour would be cheaper, because if you want to have a factory in England and English wages are too high, you just open up a factory in France where it would have been cheaper. So this led to like a decline of pricing and those sorts of things, which helped get rich people richer. So initially you had left-wing people like Dennis Skinner, Jeremy Corbyn, opposing further European integration. However, it is a lot more political now. It's a lot more complex. It's no longer just about an economic connection, but a political one about defending rights, having a social chapter as well. So it has become a lot bigger, the European community, since its first origins in 1957. So is the EU Hitler's realisation of a German-dominated Europe? So this is a speech that came from Boris Johnson, and he said, over the last 3,000 years, there has been all sorts of attempts in Europe to recreate the dream of a Roman Empire, and very often that's been done by force. Napoleon, Hitler, various people tried this out, and it ends tragically. The EU is an attempt to do this by different methods. It's tried to do it in a more bureaucratic way. So Boris Johnson there is doing this extremely intentionally as well. He'd deny it, but very intentionally, Boris Johnson is deliberately making a correlation between two of the great dictators of modern history, Napoleon and Hitler, and both of those people aim to take over Britain, take over other countries, and extend their power. And he's saying the EU is the same thing. They're just not doing it through war now, they're doing it through bureaucracy. So bureaucracy is things like laws, red tape, rules, and that sort of thing. So he's making a very, very clear argument that the aim of the EU is domination of Europe. And he's making it the argument that it's German-dominated Europe, and that's because Germany is the most powerful country within the EU. And he goes on to say, but fundamentally, what is lacking is the eternal problem, which is that there is no underlying loyalty to the idea of Europe. There is no single authority that anybody respects or understands that is causing a massive democratic void. So he's also making that argument that countries in Europe don't see themselves as European. So I think that's particularly true in Britain, and I find it quite interesting when you go to a European country compared to Britain. So for example, if you go and visit a historic site in Portugal like Sagres, you will see a European flag and a Portuguese flag. You'll also see a massive sign that says that part of the restoration and protection of the castle and the site there is paid for by the EU. That's because the EU funds things to protect the cultural history of different states. It does the same in Britain, but in Britain they don't shout out about it. We're very quiet about the things that we benefit from the EU, and it's things like cinema. So there's a cinema in Kilburn which is funded by the EU, or partially funded by the EU. So is there any truth to the idea that people in Europe don't see themselves as European? I think perhaps in Britain, definitely true, but not so much in other countries around Europe as well. So what I want you to do is just answer that question. What is Johnson arguing is the aim of the EU? And just generally just think about, is it right to argue that this is the correct aim of the EU, just domination of Europe? And has it failed in its aims? So first we need to really consider, what were the aims of the EU? So why was the EU formed? And this here is a picture of Dresden in Germany. So as you can see, absolutely destroyed. And it was destroyed during the Second World War, when Britain and America decided to try out a new technique to more effectively murder thousands of people, and that was by heavily bombing one centre of a town. So they just kept excessively dropping bombs in this one centre of the town. And what that ended up doing was it created so much heat that anybody in the vicinity of those bombs, so not just the people who were hit by them, but people in the vicinity of those bombs, would be killed. This is actually a war crime because it's just wanton destruction and murder of civilians. However, because Britain and America were obviously the victors in that war, there's nobody to really hold them account for committing a crime during the war. And you can see then that the Europe after the Second World War was one that was destroyed. So obviously physically destroyed, but I think sort of maybe more morally destroyed too. And there was this hope that instead of having another war, because bear in mind the First World War happened and then the Second World War happened, people were terrified that there would be a Third World War. So what the countries around Europe wanted to try and do was to make it so that they would be more interconnected with each other. And if they were directly connected to each other through coal and steel, which was the first phase, then that would essentially mean that they wouldn't come and attack each other anymore because they would be more interdependent. So what I want you to do is answer these two questions. The foundations of the EU were laid in the European coal and steel community. What do you think it wanted to achieve? And how much do you think the EU has changed since its inception in 1950? So initially it's just about connecting coal and steel. So why coal and steel actually as well? And essentially coal and steel were the instruments of war. So they're things that make war more effective. So instead of making it about building up your own coal and steel factories and so forth, it's about connecting them with the different countries across Europe so that there's less war-making materials for individual nations. So that's the key term there. This evolved, so in 1950 it was initially coal and steel, but in 1957 you had the birth of the EU, or the modern EU, and that was the Treaty of Rome. So this was signed by the different states who were involved in economic coal and steel community, so West Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands and Luxembourg. And the idea of it was to create a common market in order to break down internal trade barriers. So it's about trying to get people to connect a lot more and saying, let's trade together, let's have interdependence so that we don't look to compete with each other. It's about working together to have a more profitable and healthy society. So these were the aims in 1957. As you can see, as I was saying earlier, this was an economic aim. It's about creating more economic cohesiveness between the different nation states. However, these aims have substantially grown over time. And you can see here then, so these are the 5 aims of the EU. You have social policy, enlargement, economic union, the single market, and political union as well. So in terms of like an economic union, what that essentially meant was about creating more by connecting the economies of Europe a lot more. So you had the Economic and Monetary Union formed, which is the goal for all member states to be connected together, having a central bank, having a common currency as well. So the single currency, the euro, was introduced in 1999 and actually started to be tendered from 2002, which means that, you know, if you wanted to sell something in France, you wouldn't have to pay any exchange rates to sell something in France from Germany, for example. So whenever you go on holiday and you go to a European country, you can actually lose money because you have to pay to exchange your money. So all of this was about trying to reduce those costs and trying to make it so that there was more fluidity across the different European states. Now, if we're thinking about Britain losing its sovereignty, it's quite an obvious one that we don't have the euro, and that's because Britain decides how much it wants to opt into the European market, and you can see in 1999 it chose not to join the European currency. You also have enlargement as well. So enlargement is about expanding the EU. So you essentially, the European community want to have more countries involved. And this was especially true after the Cold War, because what happened was the EU ended up absorbing former communist states. And it aims to further this European unity and expand this trading bloc to create more cohesiveness and try and hold a stable peace in Europe. So you can only actually join the European Union if you fulfill the liberal democratic criteria, which is why Croatia joined so late, because they actually struggled to fulfill that criteria. They had to reform their government, they had to have greater transparency before they were actually able to join. So you also have the single market. So the single market is about economic integration, so building on that economic union idea, but this is more so about trade. So the Single European Act of 1985 created a single European market based on the 4 freedoms. So these freedoms are free movement of goods, services, people and capital within the EU single market. So what that means then is if you are selling something in Britain from Germany, you do not pay any tariffs for that trade. You don't have to pay any fees or anything like that. It's just one set price. So services and people, so it also means things like people were able to travel across Europe freely as well. So a German citizen coming to work in London doesn't have to have a visa. They're able to move and they can move freely and work in any country. But one of the negative things that could come out of this is this idea, if you're going to have a single market, then what can happen is people are going to get undercut. If you're going to have immigration, then maybe people who are immigrants are going to work for less than people who are nationals of that country. And as I said earlier, if you have a factory in Britain and you insist in your country that any companies pay workers fair wages, they're just going to go to France instead. So what was created was the social chapter or the social policy that came out of this. And this is This is essentially saying it's looking to counterbalance the freedoms of the single market to ensure that workers don't suffer disadvantage and discrimination. So it ensures that the playing field is levelled over domination of bigger firms, moving to states with weaker worker rights and cheap labour. And finally, you have the political union as well. This was formulated really strongly in the Lisbon Treaty, and it's about creating a balance between institutions that operate in an intergovernmental way, so encouraging states to cooperate with each other in decision making, and about protecting state interests but working towards common goals, because if the European Union prospers, all the countries within the European Union prosper as well. So what you're going to do is I've created an ebook for you, and it's got text in it, but it's also got videos that I found to help answer the questions. And what I want you to do is open it. Preferably the best way to open it is as an iBook, then you can play the videos straight off. If you don't have an iPad or an iPhone, then just do it as a PDF. And you're going to look at these 5 different aims of the EU, and you're going to write down, so for example, social policy, just a brief summary of what social policy is. Then you're going to put down how it has been successful and how it has failed, and then have an evaluation of overall, is it a success or is it a failure? And you're going to do that for all 5 of the aims of the EU. So, is the EU a federal superstate? So this is Margaret Thatcher commenting on the EU. What is it that she's saying about the EU?
It is our purpose to retain the power and influence of this House and not to denude it of many of the powers. I wonder what the Right Honourable Gentleman's policy is in view of some of the things he said. Would he have agreed to a commitment to extend the community's powers to other supplementary sectors of economic integration without having any definition of what they are? Would he? Because you would have thought he would from what he said. One of them was that the Commission wants to extend its powers and competence into the area of health. We said no, we weren't going to agree to those things. And what he says, he sounded as if he would, for the sake of agreeing, for the sake of being little Sir Echo and saying me too. Would he have agreed to extending qualified majority voting within the Council, to delegating implementing powers to the Commission, to a common security policy, all without any attempt to define or limit them? The answer is yes. He hasn't got a clue about the definition of some of the things he is saying, let alone securing a definition of others. Yes, the Commission does want to increase its powers. Yes, it is a non-elected body, and I do not want the Commission to increase its powers against this House. So, of course, we are differing. Of course, the chairman or the president of the Commission, Mr. Delors, said at press conference the other day that he wanted the European Parliament to be the democratic body of the community. He wanted the Commission to be the executive, and he wanted the Council of Ministers to be the Senate. No, no, no. Perhaps the Labour Party would give all those things up easily. Perhaps they would agree to a single currency, to total abolition of the pound sterling. Perhaps being totally incompetent with monetary matters, they'd be only too delighted to hand over the full responsibility, as they did to the IMF, to a central bank. The fact is, they have no competence on money, no competence on the economy, so yes, the Right Honourable Gentleman would be glad to hand it all over. But what is the point in trying to get elected to Parliament only to hand over your sterling and to hand over the powers of this House to...
Okay, so I think Margaret Thatcher is making some very interesting points, particularly when you consider she was saying this in the 80s, and how many of those things that she was concerned about have actually become true. So the idea of qualified member voting has actually gone through in the EU, so that members in the European Council essentially have the same amount of votes as they do in correlation to their population, to try and make it more fair. So the development of the EU and the fears of Margaret Thatcher have certainly given some legitimacy to the Eurosceptic view of an EU federal superstate. And what that essentially means is that it's the argument that the EU is like the United States of America, in that you have one central body which has the absolute power, but they are more sort of localised affairs. They let individual states deal with that. So it's about Britain protecting its idea of it being a nation rather than a state of the European Union. So does the EU govern Britain then? So you have 3 different bodies to consider here. So the first one is the European Council, which is made up of heads of government, and this is how a treaty is passed, and they negotiate a new treaty. So a treaty is a legal document that sets out the power of EU institutions and the rules for decision makings. So things like having a European constitution, the powers of different bodies in the EU, and so forth. So the people who actually decide and negotiate these treaties are the heads of government. And naturally, there will be some heads of government which have more clout than others. And the 3 main powerful countries in this who have the most say, even if it's not officially, would be Britain, France, and Germany. So what happens then is the European Council negotiate the treaty. Then the treaty is voted on in the European Parliament. So every 4 years, for example, in Britain, we vote for our member of European Parliament and they go and sit in the European Parliament. So it was actually a bit of a controversy because we were still in the EU in the last election, which was only last year. And essentially, even though we're leaving the EU, we still ended up having to send MEPs there. And you've probably seen a lot of the videos around of British MEPs essentially embarrassing this country because they're being really jingoistic, they're waving national flags, which you're not allowed to do, and just causing a ruckus and not taking the institution very seriously. So their role in the European Parliament is to vote on other things, but one of the things that they vote on is, are they happy with the treaty that their heads of state have negotiated? Then the third and final stage is this treaty is ratified by each member state based on domestic law. So in Britain, it just is voted on in Parliament and agreed, and that's it. In Ireland, so because it's based on domestic law, your country decides on how does it ratify, so how does it put this EU treaty into the law of their own country. So Britain just lets Parliament do it. In Ireland, they can only agree on a treaty with a referendum. So in 2007, you had the Lisbon Treaty. The Irish people in a referendum voted against the Lisbon Treaty. So changes had to be made to the Lisbon Treaty in order to make it more palatable for the Irish population. Those changes were made, and then the Lisbon Treaty was brought back to Ireland, and Ireland voted and agreed to enforce it in a referendum. So again, it's up to Britain how it decides to ratify and agree these treaties. And you can see very clearly Britain has quite a strong say in the nature of these treaties and the composition of these treaties. And they are our elected officials, our elected head of government, as well as the elected MEPs, which then goes to our government. So not really, right? It doesn't really govern Britain because Britain has quite a strong say in the nature of this. So why is there so much negativity towards the European Union? And I think you have the role of the press, and you can see there's an article here. Now they've really gone bananas. Euro bosses ban 2 bendy ones and set minimum shop size of 5.5 inches. So Euro bosses, okay, so again this idea of bosses, people who have control over you and you don't have any say over what's going on, and highlighting a really silly rule in order to frustrate people and think, why are we paying 55 million pounds a day to be part of this organisation? And saying again, Brussels bureaucrats. So proved yesterday what a balmy bunch they are by outlawing curved bananas. So what I want us to think about is, what role have the press played in harbouring tensions against the EU? So James O'Brien reads out a list of headlines about the EU. So what is the effect of these headlines?
20 years worth of headlines put together by a blogger called Tom Pride. I shall start now. EC regulations to ban playgrounds, Daily Express. Rolling acres outlawed by Brussels, Daily Telegraph. EU to scrap British exams, Sunday Express. Obscure EU law halting the sale of English oak seeds, Mail on Sunday. EU may try to ban sweet and toy ads, The Times. EU to tell British farmers what they can grow, Daily Mail. EU bans boozing, Daily Star. Light ale to be forced to change its name by Eurocrats, Daily Mail. EU fanatics to be forced to sing dire anthem about EU motherland, The Sun. British apple trees facing chop by EU, The Times. Domain names .uk to be replaced by .eu, Daily Mail. EU to ban bagpipes and trapeze artists, The Sun. Children to be banned from blowing up balloons under EU safety rules, Daily Telegraph. Straight cucumbers, The Sun. Curved bananas banned by Brussels bureaucrats, The Sun, The Daily Mail, The Daily Express. Brussels bans barmaids from showing cleavage, The Sun, The Daily Telegraph. Rumpole wig to be scrapped by EU, The Mail on Sunday. Church bells silenced by fear of EU law, The Daily Telegraph. Motorists to be charged to drive in city centres under EU plans, The Daily Telegraph. EU to stop binge drinking by slapping extra tax on our booze, The Sun. Brandy butter to be renamed Brandy Spreadable Fat, The European.
Okay, so as you can see there is a ridiculous string of quite high profile. It's not just the tabloid papers, it's respected papers too, throwing in really ridiculous headlines and articles which essentially create a hysteria about the EU. And somebody who was actually fired for this, so Boris Johnson used to be the European correspondent for The Times, and he actually created a sensationalized story about prawn and cocktail flavoured crisps. So what had happened was the EU were investigating how can we best combat childhood obesity. And one of the things that they were looking at was the amount of additives in foods. So there was a high level of additives, which causes addiction, which obviously creates more obesity. This food can be created without this amount of additives. So the European Union were thinking, how can we best encourage businesses to do that? What happened was Boris Johnson decided to change this and really warp this narrative and say EU bans crisps and packed lunches and really over-exaggerates this. He even gets fake interviews from European MEPs and so forth to try and verify this. So he actually lies and makes things up, and he does this several times while working for The Times, and then is ultimately fired, although ends up getting a job at the Telegraph afterwards. So says a lot about that kind of journalism. So essentially these sensationalized stories have been going on since Britain joined the European community, and it has helped to harbour these tensions against the EU, making it seem like the EU is some dictator, trying to change British way of life, trying to take away young people's freedom to get fat, and all those sorts of things. So it's essentially making it so that it's a very unhealthy relationship between people in Britain and the European Union. So I think people shouldn't have really been that shocked when in 2016 it was a Leave vote and it was a Leave result, because this is something that's been going on for decades. So just want you to answer that question in a full sentence in your book. So what role have the press played in harbouring tensions against the EU?
20 years.
So EU laws then. So that's another thing which is constantly talked about, right? So the EU has control over British laws, and there's two types of laws that we will look at. You have directives and you have regulations. So a directive then sets out a goal that all European member states must work towards and pass their own laws to reach their goal. So one of the most famous ones would be the smoking ban. And as you can see, just looking at this map, you've got different colours. So you've got comprehensive, nationwide, and no policies in place. And you can see not every single European country has done the same thing with the smoking ban. So in Britain, it is illegal to smoke indoors. You cannot smoke indoors in Britain, in a public place, sorry. And you can see in France, it isn't illegal completely, but in some places there are restrictions. In Portugal, you can go into a pub, and as long as there's good enough air conditioning, you are able to smoke. In Germany, so the country which is accused of being this dictator in the European Union, you can legally smoke inside some bars. So there is no... So the directive is, we all want to work towards a world where less people are dying of cancer, and one of the easiest ways to do this is to discourage people from smoking. They discussed that in the EU, and they said, you need to try and work out in your country how best can you reduce smoking. And in Britain decided to have an outright ban on smoking indoors. So there's been several directives over time to try and reduce this. So things like not having lipstick style packaging, so smaller cigarettes, getting rid of small packs of cigarettes, because that was apparently, they did research and that encouraged women to smoke. I'm not so sure about that. Trying to have picture warnings to stop people from smoking, which was a European directive. And again, up to you how much you want to enforce this in your country. You also have regulations. Now, regulations are a lot firmer. So they're binding and they need to be enforceable immediately, although you do get time. So, for example, the GDPR legislation, so General Data Protection Regulation, was passed because there was a realisation that with the development of technology, people are losing a very basic right to privacy. So as a result of this, they tried to regulate this so that you would have more rights and more control over your actual data. So this was passed in 2016 and implemented in 2018. So each country gets a good 2 years to prepare how they're actually going to make GDPR work in their country. And that is an enforceable thing. So it is not optional. You actually have to follow this and implement it effectively as well. So what I want you to do then is just write an answer to what is the difference between a directive and regulation. So do EU laws mean that the EU governs Britain? So you have then the way that the directives and legislations are passed then. So the European Council sets out the guidelines, then the European Commission proposes the laws, then the Council of the European Union and European Parliament jointly decide on the adoption of the new law. Then the implementation of a law is the responsibility of committees of the European Council. And essentially, does Britain have a role in this? Well, yes, because obviously Britain sits on the European Council and the European Parliament. Elected British representatives sit there, so they do actually have a say in how these are constructed. And because Britain has such a large population, they have more votes than smaller countries like Croatia, for example. So we're going to look at 2 examples of EU laws and decide whether or not they govern Britain. So the 2 that we're going to look at, 2 case studies, are UK social policy and the UK common fisheries policy. So you're going to read these 2 case studies and you're going to write an answer to what do they reveal about the EU's ability to govern Britain. So just a quick summary of them. So you have the common fisheries policy, which was in British law, it says that you can fish in different areas. However, a European quota regulated the amount of fish that you could fish, and they also said that Britain needs to allow European countries into its waters to fish. Now, a Spanish fishing company, so Factme, went and tried to fish in British waters, and they were sent back and told they were not allowed to access British waters. But the European Union said, no, you've signed up to the common fisheries policy, which means you've just violated European law. So this went to the predecessor to the Supreme Court, the Law Lords in the House of Lords, and because they were the highest court at the time, and they essentially said that the British law defending British waters is inferior to the EU law. Therefore, the British government had to pay a fine because of this. And then the social policy is about what I was talking about earlier, the social chapter, and it's about trying to protect the rights of workers in different countries. John Major actually decided to really restrict the amount that Britain signed up to this, the social chapter, and saying we're going to have very minimal red tape. We don't want to have all these excessive laws protecting workers' rights because it's just going to slow business down. And then when Tony Blair came to power, he decided to enforce many of the laws, like the minimum wage and so forth. Okay. So, in terms of what's next then, Britain has now left the EU. What does that actually mean? What will Britain's relationship with the European Union look like? And looking at the negotiations so far, it doesn't seem like it's going to be a very positive relationship. And then what is Britain going to do on the world stage next? So obviously it's quite close allies of America, but for America it's their interest before anybody else's. So it's not really the same sort of organisation as the EU, which is looking to try and benefit all of its members.